So we're here, we're continuing our look at the cross. And we're going to look at who killed Jesus. I'm offering to you that Jesus on the cross is the most clear image of God. It's the pinnacle moment where God reveals who he is. And we have this phrase that I learned from another pastor, and I believe it's the epitome of what it is. And it's that God is like Jesus. God has always been like Jesus. There has never been a time when God was not like Jesus. We haven't always known what God was like, but now we do. God is like Jesus. And last week we considered how Jesus viewed his death. We considered, okay, what does Jesus think his death is going to accomplish? And he saw it as having three significant meanings. It would be the judgment of the world. In other words, it would show a world whose system of civilization traces all the way back to the killing of Abel, to be established upon blame and sacrifice and violence. With Jesus, the world will be stripped naked of its pretense and exposed for what it really is. Jesus also considered his death would remove Satan as ruler. When love expressed in forgiveness comes into the world, Satan no longer has a monopoly. Jesus said his death would also draw people to Jesus. In other words, it would reorder the world. It would become a gravitational force of love that would begin to exert itself on those who are otherwise orbiting around religious axes, sacrifice and politics and power. And the cross would become this drawing force as Jesus is lifted up. So now we're going to take a look at who's responsible for Jesus' death. I've been contending that God has no need for and no active hand in the death of Jesus on the cross. We do not read in Scripture that God had to reconcile himself to the world. Instead, we read that he was reconciling the world to himself. God needed to do something that would draw humanity out from behind the tree we started hiding behind all the way back in the Garden of Eden. And Jesus understood that his crucifixion would draw people. As I read John 3:16, we'll get it up there if it shows up. There we go. As I read it, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. It's not that God had so much wrath to overcome with the world that he gave his only son. But it's the second version that the Western church has grabbed onto. Someone must receive the wrath of God. I took this slide. It's one of thousands from different sermons that are out there. See if we'll pull up. Can you go to the next slide? There we go. This is one cover slide from many sermons. If you can't see the words, it says, "The wrath of God was satisfied." This has been the focus of many churches and their sermons. N.T. Wright, he's an amazing theologian. He puts it well when we consider this issue of the wrath of God. He says the danger of this kind of popular teaching is that ultimately we end up rewriting one of the most famous Bible verses. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Look at the two words, N.T. Wright says. God so loved the world that he gave his son. The trouble with the popular version as described in the penal substitution idea that God had wrath. The problem with this popular version is that it can easily be heard as saying instead that God so hated the world, he was so wrathful towards the world, that he killed his only son. And that doesn't sound like good news at all. If we arrive at that conclusion, we know that we have not just made a trivial mistake that could easily be corrected, but a major blunder. We have portrayed God not as the generous creator, the loving father, but as an angry despot. The idea belongs not in biblical picture, but in pagan belief. So I'm contending that the wrath of God, this idea of the wrath of God being satisfied on the cross is incorrect. So if God sacrificed his son into our system, but I'm claiming that God did not need Jesus to die, who killed Jesus? We can go to a blank slide, Tim. I've given you a list of verses that show who killed Jesus. Time and again, you'll see that Jesus was handed over to men. Time and again, in particular, some of the verses show that Jesus was handed over to sinful men. In particular, on the list on the back side of the page, there's 3 verses that I'm just going to sum up. Acts 3:15 sums up as, you killed and God raised. Acts 5:30, God raised whom you killed. Acts 7:52, you murdered Jesus. Time and again, we will see that God had no need for Jesus to die. Others did, though. Others whose systems were threatened by the coming of Jesus. As Jesus undermines the systems of religion and politics, the high priest and the Roman governor need Jesus to die. And Jesus lays down his life. He tells Pilate, if my system was of this world, my followers would fight as the world does. And instead he goes to the cross. If we think that God needed Jesus to die on the cross, I believe we miss the cross for what it truly is. Because what we do is we reduce those who killed Jesus to really tools of God against Jesus, as God acts against Jesus to solve his problem. But when we realize that those who killed Jesus were opposing God and Jesus, now God and Jesus are on one side, and the systems of the world run by sinful men are on the other side. And the cross becomes a showdown between God's and Jesus' side against the key institutions of the world. And what happens is the cross becomes an indictment against the religious and political system. The Gospels highlight the roles of Caiaphas, who was the high priest, and Pilate, who was the Roman governor. They highlight these 2 individuals in the killing of Jesus. But not because they are individually to blame for Jesus' death. They are both products of and figureheads of the 2 systems of the world, of religion and politics. And the Gospels are the story of a showdown between God in Jesus against the rulers of the world. So first today, we're going to look at Pilate, the Roman governor, the political ruler. It's an interesting study, as one theologian, he comments of Pilate. Pilate deserves our sympathies. Not because he was good, though tragically mistaken, But because we are not much better, we may believe in Jesus, but we do not always believe in his ideas. At least not his ideas about violence, truth, and justice. The idea here is that while we as Christians reject Pilate's crucifixion of Jesus, we tend to be sympathetic towards Pilate's view of the world and the system he represents. But it's a system that kills Jesus. We're sympathetic to the idea that the world is and must be run by power. And that power means we can kill the bad guy. Obviously. And having eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, humanity's very good at telling you who is good and who is evil. The reality that we're sympathetic to Pilate and sympathetic to his system is it's not always clearly exposed to us. But this is how the governments of the world have always run. At its foundation, all governments ultimately work on the threat of deadly force to make things go their way. And we like it. We like the security of it when it works for us. And we dislike it when it doesn't. It's being caught in this system, though, that keeps Pilate from being able to understand what Jesus is all about. In the interactions with Jesus, you can tell that Pilate's wrestling. Pilate's confused as to what is going on. And this is because Jesus is so counter to anything Pilate understands about how the world works and how the systems are to operate. Jesus does tell Pilate, I'm a king with a kingdom. But he also tells Pilate that my kingdom is not from this world. The word from means out of or even caused by. Jesus is saying that his kingdom, Jesus' kingdom, originates from a system that is alien to this world and anything this world has birthed. And Jesus makes it clear how to tell the difference in systems. Jesus says, if you have a system of this world, it will operate and grow how the world knows. It will operate and grow how any political system does. It will operate and grow by the power of violence. And my followers will be fighting and killing on my behalf. Power through violence is a distinguishing mark of worldly systems, Jesus points out. And he says, do you see my followers killing anyone? This is the evidence that my system is alien to this world. And we're sympathetic to Pilate and the difficulty it is for him to comprehend that there's any other way of doing things except with power. Peter struggles to get it. Even after years of walking with Jesus, here it comes. It's time for Jesus to be arrested. And Peter assumes this is how kingdoms work. They need violent power. And Jesus is about to be arrested. It's time for violent power. And he draws his sword. And he goes to enter into battle. But Jesus says no. And Peter enters into a crisis of faith, I believe, as he wrestles to understand and ultimately will understand what Pilate cannot. I think we often take Peter's 3 denials of Jesus as cowardice. But Peter's far from a coward. He just proved it. He drew his sword, ready to fight. He was the first into the fight. But Jesus says, no, that's not what we're doing. And the next time we meet Peter after this moment that sends him, I believe, into a crisis of faith, the next time we see Peter is when someone says to him, I recognize you. You're part of Jesus's crew. And Peter's shaken. He thought he was. He thought he knew how the crew operated. But now he has to wonder if he was even part of it, as he apparently missed something significant. And I believe that it's in his shaken confidence. It's in his struggle with what the heck is going on here. It's not cowardice, but it's in the uncertainty of his understanding that he denies Jesus. Peter's response with the sword is the response of the world. Jesus is meant to rule, and for Peter, or anyone, ruling must be backed by violence when the time comes. To think of any other way has been equated to asking a fish to imagine a world without water. We are immersed in a world that simply operates on violent power. We are in a world whose peace hinges on the mutual threat of thousands of nuclear warheads. As we just think somebody hopefully will not launch them. So it's not simply by chance, I believe, that Matthew pairs Peter's difficulties and his struggles that results in denial. He pairs that with Pilate's difficulties to understand. Both of them are wrestling with how Jesus is doing things. So Jesus is arrested and put on trial before Pilate. But there's a different trial going on here that Pilate misses. He doesn't recognize what's happening. And as Jesus stands in Pilate's court, Jesus has said, I am the kingdom of God. And so as Jesus stands in Pilate's court, the violent power politics of the world, represented by Pilate, are also standing in heaven's courts. It's a trial of the world's systems of power, whose truth is verbalized so well by Pilate. We considered the last week the moment where Pilate says, what is truth? And Jesus falls silent. So Pilate moves to give Jesus an education on what truth is. Pilate essentially tells Jesus, I guess you're ignorant to the truth that rules the world. You are ignorant to the truth of how this game is played. Let me show you truth, buddy. The truth is that I have power. And here's the key to Pilate's truth. Pilate says, I will show you the truth that lies at the bottom of everything in this world. And it is specifically the power to kill who needs killing. And Pilate tells Jesus, we take people like you who won't cooperate with our system, and we nail you to a tree to hang there until you're dead. Pilate says, the cross is my truth. The cross for Pilate is the representation of the truth that underlies the world of power held together by violence. So Pilate seeks to give Jesus an education. Jesus can't answer what truth is. So Pilate says, I'll teach you. I'll teach you what truth is. And the truth is, I have the power to kill you. God has come in the flesh to his own creation to find a creation where he set his image as its pinnacle. An image that Jesus is going to show involves a center, an axis of love that is expressed through forgiveness. But those who should carry his image, humans, image bearers of God, those who should carry his image are instead sympathetic to Pilate's truth. The axis must be power expressed through violence. This is the great lie that the devil placed into the world. Back to Cain establishing his city upon his power to kill. But Jesus comes to bear witness to the lost truth. It's a truth that now lies buried under a mountain of bodies that date all the way back to Abel. Jesus embodies the truth that was lost since the beginning of time. Matthew 13:35 tells us that Jesus has come to proclaim what was hidden since the foundation of the world. I believe since it was buried with the body of Abel. And here's the truth. Here's what Jesus came to open our eyes to testify to pull out from under the mountains of innocent bodies. The truth that we continue to try to pile more bodies onto. Just the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I read a recent statistic that a study was finally done that says approximately those that we can number who have died from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is approximately 4.5 million. We've made it halfway to the number of Jews that Hitler killed. This is power expressed in violence. And Jesus says, I'm going to pull this truth out from under the mountain of bodies. And here's the truth. God is love. And God created the world from love, by love, and for love. And the world can be arranged around love. Because that's its grain. That's its origin. But it's scary to leave the orbit of power. We can fear what might happen if we fail to get and keep our fingers on power. Power that we can back up with violence if we need to. Power that gives us the ability to decide who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And the power to ultimately kill those we consider bad. It's scary to leave the orbit of power. And as we finished last week, one pastor has said, following the way of Jesus into love, expressing forgiveness, sounds dangerous. We could get hurt. And the pastor reminds us of Jesus' response. If any of you will become my disciples, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. It's dangerous. You can get hurt. But you can get hurt living in the power of violence. So Jesus leads the way to the cross. He tells his followers, pick up your cross, deny yourself, follow me. And then Jesus leads the way to the cross. And he is nailed to Pilate's truth. He is nailed to the world's truth. And what we find at the cross is that Pilate's right. The cross is truth. But it's not the truth Pilate thought it was. It's not the truth of violent power that the cross declares. The cross declares the truth of forgiving love. And Jesus steals Pilate's symbol of truth. Pilate forever loses the ability to point to the cross and say, there is truth. Because his truth is exposed as a lie by Jesus. And real truth picks up the cross as the evidence of forgiving love. And we now wear the cross because it has shown us what the real truth is. Jesus has come to reframe things. He's come to bear witness to the truth that God is love. And that we can reorganize our lives around love. As one pastor put it, the gospel is the good news of freedom from the great lie of Pilate's truth and entry into the kingdom of love. It is with Jesus upon the cross, arms open wide, loving and forgiving, that he says he will draw all people to himself. The church has erred in trying to coerce and push people into Jesus. The conquistadors, they used the point of the sword. Others, going back to the famous example of Jonathan Edwards and beyond, have used the fear and the threat of hell to try to force people to Jesus. But Jesus says, it is my love and forgiveness on display that will draw people away from the lie of Pilate, away from their orbit around violent power, and into a new orbit of forgiving love.